As defensive shooters, you don't get to pick when you need a gun to protect yourself. Criminals do, which is why you're always playing catch-up in defensive shooting incident. If you're not training right, the time at the range will probably have little benefit when you actually need to protect yourself with your gun. We're going to talk to Mike DeSargo next on how to train better.
But first, if you own a gun in California, you should have an attorney that specializes in California gun laws on your speed dial. I'm serious. Because if you ever have legal matters that involve firearms, you need California's firearm lawyer, John Dillon. If you have questions about red flag laws, gun registration, gun transportation, or maybe you just need to know that your guns are California compliant. Our trusted firearms attorney is John Dillon. John Dillon specializes in California gun laws. Put his number on your phone right this minute, 760-642-7150. That's John Dillon, California firearms lawyer, 760-642-7150. All right, Desi, who's our guest?
We have Mike DeSargo with us today. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Let's talk. Introduce yourself. Tell us about what you do, who you are, and why you're here today.
My name is Mike DeSargo. I've been a long-time martial artist. I started teaching in the late 90s, and something I've found in trying to reproduce my skills and abilities in my students' performance is that technique and rehearsing technique didn't seem to be the answer. And that eventually led me to some new things I've discovered in neuroscience, specifically the pathway a very dear friend of mine, Amari Broussard, introduced me to a man named Rob Pincus, who really changed the way I think about training.
And how did he change the way you think about training?
By integrating the body's natural reactions and having that as the foundation for everything we do to remediate violence and decision-making processes and such.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So give us an example of what you're speaking of.
Well, if we just get right into defensive shooting, right?
Okay.
Defensive shooting, by virtue, is a counter-ambush circumstance, meaning that we left the house not anticipating that we're going to need to use a firearm to defend our life.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did know that, then we should probably have some kind of security consultation about our decision-making processes and such. But ultimately, it's that variable where we didn't know what was going to happen and we don't know what's going to happen next. And those two questions are paramount with how we train. And when everything you said about we don't get to choose when we need to defend our life, right? So we all recognize that, but how is that reflected in training and our training methods? How do we process information? How we can get better at processing information? So we have two worst-case scenarios. The worst-case scenario is that there's an imminent threat to our life, whether it's a home invasion, whether that's a criminal violence of any kind. The other worst-case scenario is what if something changes in our body that changes how we perceive reality? And what I mean is, in the back of our brain, we have this little center called the amygdala, and it's the fight or flight center. And when there's an imminent threat in our life, it triggers the HP axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, to secrete what I like to call the survival serum. It's a blend of acetylcholine, dopamine, and adrenaline, but specifically what we want to talk about is the adrenaline in the body and the adrenaline in the brain, respectively called epinephrine and norepinephrine. What tends to happen is externally, we're going to react naturally. You know, if I throw a market at you, at your chest.
Duck.
I'm sorry?
You're going to duck. If
you're going to do something to protect yourself, right?
Yeah.
You're going to lower your center of gravity. You're going to take action. You're going to
Right.
react before you even realize what's happening.
Right.
That's a defense mechanism that's embedded within our body. Now, the magnitude of our reaction, our physical reaction, is going to be contingent on our level of anticipation and recognition. So someone who's been around gunshots for a long time can easily distinguish, relatively speaking, between the backfire of an exhaust and an actual gunshot, right? Or say Chinese New Year firecrackers in LA Chinatown, versus gunshots kind of deal. But the point being is our hands are going to move above the hips and below the eye lines to protect us in some sort of fashion. Now, internally, when that survival serum starts influencing our perception of reality, the way it does that is our brain starts to speed up and our perception of time tends to look like it's slowing down. Right. So what's going to happen is your internal dialogue is going to continue at the pace that you and I are talking, but the way people are moving is going to look like slow motion. It's going to be very surreal. So we have this thing called attenuation. And what our brain does, it filters out irrelevant information. So right now, you're paying attention to my voice and not the sensation of the fabric on your skin. But now that I've brought your attention to the fabric on your skin, you can start to notice how the fabric feels on your skin. Our sensory systems are bombarded by information all the time. So the way we manage our attention also plays a role in our situational awareness. It's going to be a topic for another time. Where it's relevant here is when our life is threatened, the most important thing to the brain is that threat. So we get all our attention, all our focus committed. So
Tunnel vision.
I'm sorry?
Tunnel vision.
We can call it tunnel vision, absolutely. And technically, it's the increased visual acuity in the center field of vision, right? And we don't actually lose peripheral vision, it's our attention. You ever turn down the radio to look for an address?
Yes.
Right? And so that's called attentional blindness because our attention is divided. Even though you're looking at the address, you can't see it because the radio is distracting you.
Yeah.
So the same thing happens. We think it's tunnel vision. We still are receiving light in our peripheral vision, but our attention is focused on that knife. And not only that, when the norepinephrine changes the physiology of our brain and our eyes, it can even balloon out to look like a Mickey Mouse hand, and that knife is going to look disproportionately large. And everything else is going to be attenuated where you may not see it. Now, where the training value in that is going to be, say, for example, in a multiple target engagement. So with that tunnel vision, with that fixation, with that focus, most people haven't experienced that level of trauma, let alone if you have to use your firearm and stop that threat. Most people haven't even experienced what that looks like. If you get high center chest hits, what that sounds like, what that looks like. And there's a high probability that if you don't train for that circumstance, that you'll be fixated on that. So knowing that that tunnel vision is going to be like looking through binoculars, the very act and habit of physically moving your neck will shift those binoculars around. So when we train assessment on the range, it's not about just arbitrarily whipping our heads around, right? We need to train cognitive flexibility because two things happen if there's a multiple target engagement. The most critical thing that's relevant is the second a prey or the victim shoots back, the predators do anything other than staying where they were previously. Right. And so what we tend to see, the flaw in multiple target engagements in most ranges, we'll see them rapidly shooting across plates and using that to gauge their readiness for multiple target engagement. When in reality, the true skill that we need is cognitive flexibility. What I mean is we're focused on that first threat. We're hyper-focused on that. It's a traumatic event. We're in that tunnel vision. We're collecting all that information. That behavior has changed. They're no longer an imminent threat. So they're no longer relevant to your survival. There may be other threats. Now we know that they're probably not going to be standing where they were before. So we have to physically move our neck and shift that bino. And if now they're coming around and say if someone has a bat and coming towards you, then even though you might still be paying attention as you physically move your neck, you're still thinking about that threat. The second your brain picks up the person coming in, your attention will immediately go to that other threat. So in practice, when we shoot multiple targets, we want to actually process information. We want to recognize that it's not about how quickly I could shoot from one target to the next. It's more about how well can I process information, stop the first threat, bring it back in, assess. Look at the events that are happening on the range. If someone's reloading, someone's tying their shoe, what's going on behind you. Get used to picking up information and processing information, even though we might have static targets on the range. We want to represent the act of finding where that other predator went. Because the second the victim starts shooting back, they don't expect that. They tend to prey on easy targets. We talked about earlier, you don't look like a hard target. But someone makes that mistake, you can bet for damn sure it's going to take them by surprise when you start shooting back, right? And so high probability, high certainty that the other predators, if it's a multiple target engagement, they're not going to be where they were before. So that's one of the training values of integrating what the mind and body actually does during a life-threatening incident. Now, when it's something we didn't know we were going to need to do and something we don't know what's going to happen next, that also represents the predictability or unpredictability, right? And so if we have these training drills and training methods where we want to get good at our technique, then we're limiting our training to just that technique. Earlier, I was talking to a Filipino martial arts buddy of mine. There was a tournament yesterday. In Filipino martial arts, there's quite a bit of stick and knife drills that are very choreographed, and it looks really good, really, really good. You can get really good at technique. But when you go to the tournaments, it doesn't mirror what they did in practice. And the question being, why doesn't it mirror that? Well, because things are changing. The range is changing. The perception is changing, the depth perception, the angles and such. And so we want to replicate that experience. When we talk about people's backgrounds, people tend to qualify instructors by asking, what's your background? What they're really asking is, what's your experience with this? What we're really saying is that there's value in experience. So then if we think about there's value in experience, then we should be replicating experience in our training, right? And not just the one side of technique, not just the one side of hole punching on paper, but intrinsically taking into account the body's natural reactions, not just the mechanics. Now, we're in our own lives, we're always the hero of our own story, right? So we always want to look cool. But if we train for the worst case scenario, we also have to account for the fact that what if internally I'm not as brave as I was before? What if I'm emotionally compromised in some way? Because typically when in the range, we're shooting and we're the hero, we're saving everybody's lives, right? What happens if before I even realize I'm in danger, my daughter gets shot? And I have to process that first, right? And it's an active killer situation. And then you're now in that emotional state. Now you have to start from that emotional psychological state, right? That changes your access to that control, to that technique. So everything that you develop mechanically is going to be contingent on how well you process information and that event. So fundamentally, if we randomize shooting commands where we don't know what target we're going to shoot at, right? So if we talk about the game of basketball, if we practice free throws, we could get good at learning how to shoot the ball. But that doesn't prepare you to win the game. So one thing we could do is have that player run up and down the court and throw a ball at them the second they touch the ball, have them shoot from that position, right? And we're starting to see that more in competition shooting, where I'm starting to see people shoot off one leg as they try to control the momentum and such, right? That kind of speaks to the fact that like your posture below the hips isn't as relevant as above the hips. Shoulders forward of the hips and manage recoil, but the leg foot position really isn't that relevant for most shooting circumstances, right? I digress. But
we're going to come back. So hold
that
thought. That was a great break. How did you know that? Orange County gun owners are dedicated to preserving and restoring Orange County self-defense rights. And if you live in Orange County, you need to give them a jingle, ocgunowners.com. Orange County Gun Owners is the Do Something organization to restore and defend Second Amendment. Volunteer at shooting social at a gun shop tabletop and help get pro-gun local officials elected. Become a member today. ocgunowners.com/join. All right. So we're talking to Mike DeSargo, and just intriguing. And I love the way he interviews because we didn't have to ask him a question.
Nope, he just talks.
He's got it down. So let me just kind of get a little background. What got you into this type of training?
Trauma, probably.
Okay.
Childhood violence, probably some survivor's guilt. And,
Gotcha.
All things that aren't...
and that's okay. That's okay. We don't need to go deep. I mean, your life is your life. But because people always wonder, like, why do you... Desi, get into Not Me, SD, and you've got a complete story as well, and it's just what's intriguing is what drives people, and your passion is, I mean, we need a knife to get out of this room, but that's a good thing. So I'm just going to let you kind of continue on with what you were talking about, and maybe explain to the listeners, how do they go about getting involved in a course like this?
Absolutely. There's USCCA has done an outstanding job of integrating this type of training with their defensive shooting fundamentals.
Okay.
They've I also want to talk a bit about Walk the Talk America. Their USCCA is like they're at the edge of having an asymmetric advantage over all of the training organizations. Mm-hmm. They have the mental health component to it. They have the defensive shooting component to it. They could check that out. I'm going to give some more information at the end, but. And
by the way, did you notice nobody in the media talks about the mental health, that's education?
It's so important.
Yeah, and that's what they talk about, but they don't talk about it in a positive way and say, hey, there is an organization. And I just want to bring that out because we do have quite a few different sides that listen to the show. We try to be as down the middle of the road as we possibly can. But you need to listen to this stuff. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just had
No,
to.
by all means, it's all very relevant.
Right.
And when we talk about mental health, we tend to talk about it in the sense of just being barely above sick care. If we have an injury, imagine not going to physical therapy for it and just kind of getting used to the pain and accepting how much compromise we have for the rest of our lives. Say if we have a bad knee, then we have what's called the cumulative injury cycle, where we just ignore that pain, and then it eventually cascades to hip pain and back pain and just gets out of hand further down the line. And that's what tends to happen with mental health. But with the training value behind it is the big question, because most people don't want to talk about touchy-feely stuff. But the reality is, if you want to be good at violence, at having superior violence to protect yourself, then we need to understand the brain, because most of society, we don't know how to use our brain. Imagine not really knowing how to
I want to
clear.
make a man joke right now, but I'm not going to.
It wrote itself, didn't it?
Yep, you said it for me.
It's a good thing you're at arm's length. That's all I got to say. Yeah, I know. She's so good. But you're right.
Yeah. So with the mental health component, the brain, if we want to optimize the brain for performance under duress, a lot of us has voided touchy-feely stuff and shifted towards logic and reason. But like shooting, imagine only focusing on shooting speed or only focusing on shooting precision and not actually having a balance between the two. So if you've heard of a flow state, right, with elite athletes, that's when people have the right amount of stress, where they're in the zone and they're emotionally motivated and they're performing at peak levels. So what that tells us is that there's a balance between thoughts and feelings. There's a balance between reason and emotion. But again, most of us don't know the function of emotion. There's a brilliant video on YouTube developed by Dr. Jake Wiskerchen from Walk the Talk America and Zephyr Wellness. It's emotional functioning. I encourage the audience to go look up emotional functioning on YouTube. But it talks about the 10 distinct emotions that are actually signals for our survival, and how can we actually go through that emotional state. So what happens in that worst case scenario, right? We know when we talked about that tunnel vision and things that are happening. And I talked about how our dialogue is happening in this cadence, but the rest of reality is kind of in slow motion, right? So what happens in that scenario, say that you got injured or you have a knife sticking out of you. Your internal dialogue might start to fix on that. You might get different emotions happening. You have the perception. The reason why we get stuck in the actual emotion, the stimuli for emotion only lasts 3 to 9 seconds. The reason why it seems like it actually lasts longer is because our brain dwells on something that happened in the past. It's no longer in existence, or it's anticipating something in the future. That's why emotions kind of sustain where they're at, right? So if I have a knife in me and my perception triggers fear and anxiety about, oh, I could die if I don't fix this, but there's still the threat happening, then I need to shift my perception away from that and my internal dialogue away from that and take perspective, because I'm either going to get worked by the problem or I could work the problem, right? And so this is where understanding emotional functioning has training value. In our everyday life, we can practice shifting our perception and taking perspective, because our brain doesn't differentiate a verbal disagreement from physical hostility. The stress response is the same way.
So, but can we control it?
We don't want to control it. We want to experience it, understand where the spikes happen.
So basically, then react to it differently.
Yes.
Then you would have just went in blind.
Right.
At least, maybe like, okay, let's look at it before you make that decision.
Yeah, because again, the stimuli, the emotion only lasts for 3 to 9 seconds. When we habituate allowing ourselves to immerse in that, the reason why we avoid touchy-feely is because it invites
you're men.
risk. Right. Yeah. Well, I know some of my exes.
Yeah, you and me too. But we won't even go there.
Right,
That's another show. That's another show. But it's so what? I mean, what got you? I mean, I know you it was a pain. Did you all of a sudden hear it on a talk show?
Oh, so Walk the Talk America, they actually have an online anonymous screening, right? Because 60% of thetalkamerica.org or WTTA.org,
Okay.
right?
All right.
60% of gun violence is due to impulse of suicide by gun. And so if we really want to do something about gun violence, then the onus is on us to try to reduce that, right? And so monitoring where you're at with your mental health. And with that anonymous screening, you could actually do it quarterly to see where you're at.
Okay, anonymous screening. Let's kind of walk down that road just a little bit.
Yeah. So
who would that person be? Would it be me that I feel like I'm having a terrible day?
Yeah.
Or would it be me talking about you because you're my brother and I'm not happy where your head's at? And how does, I'm just kind of throwing some balls
I'll just tell my story. So I appreciated the cause. You know, there was kind of a hold my barrel thing because it's illegal to have people hold your guns, but you could take out critical components if you're in a bad place. If I'm ever in a bad place, I have friends who say, hey, man, can you hold my firing pin? You know what I mean?
Okay.
So that way it reduces that risk of impulse. But when you go online and you do that anonymous screening, it's private and it's anonymous and it's not recorded, but it gives you feedback to see where you're at and you can see the trend over time, right? And so because the area I grew up in, therapy wasn't a thing. Like most of the people I grew up with don't realize that we carry trauma, but it's not just, I mean, there's also the ethnic component because there's generational trauma with my mom being a single immigrant mom and then the generations of war from the Philippines and such. And so there's a lot of stuff we have to work through. So I was curious because I always want to be my best, right? And so I went on WTTA, kind of saw where I was at. And then I was also trying to figure out how to get asymmetric training advantages. And I was reading up a lot about how certain intelligence agencies were microdosing LSD, but that's illegal, so I wouldn't do that. You know, I was seeing a lot of research on psychedelics and how it's really priming the brain. And then I found a place here in La Jolla called Field Trip Health, and it's ketamine-assisted therapy. It's a kind of, it's a low-dose ketamine, which has been used in medicine. It's completely legal to use. And they use that to assist with the therapy that you're getting. Because you could lie to a therapist, you could game your therapist, but with certain psychedelics, it dissociates your ego. And so you can't lie to your subconscious, right? Once you consent to being a better human being and you go in, when I went in, it was life-changing. I mean, it's not guaranteed. I must have gotten lucky, but it completely transformed my life. And it was all thanks, it goes back to WTTA. You know, if I didn't take that online screening, if I wasn't curious, you know what I mean? I didn't think I was in a bad place, but I was like, you know what? It's another tool. Let me leverage that tool, see where I'm at.
And would you say being honest on the survey had a lot to do with it?
I'm sorry?
Being honest on the survey?
On the WTTA screening?
Yeah.
I mean, it's for nobody else but you. So
no, I understand, but
yeah.
because you know how come on, I got I don't want to talk about my wart or I've got an issue. I don't want to talk about it. Or I smoke pot, so I definitely don't want them to know about it.
Right.
You know, and I only say this because I guess the big key word is anonymous.
Yes.
And they just use from your name down to make any kind of, analysis or, discussion.
Yeah, and it's more of a metric of emotional states with like, are you motivated? Do you feel like you don't want to do anything today? Or, it's more relatively ambiguous, has to do with your emotional functioning. But to circle all of that back, if you improve your brain with learning how to function emotionally, you'll be able to process information better. Because if we don't allow ourselves to experience the 3 to 9 seconds of emotions, we tend to be stuck in that amygdala hijack. And even though we don't think we're touchy-feely, the anger replaces the touchy-feely. And anger is an emotion that's going to diminish our reason and diminish our logic, and we're just going to have this tough guy persona, right? Or we're just pissed off at everything. And that's an imbalance of that peak performance level. But once we remediate what's behind the anger, then the logic and reasoning can balance and you can get that peak performance.
Is this a male-female thing?
No, it's all together. And I encourage everybody to look up Mikhail Vega on the Sean Ryan Show. He is a former Navy SEAL. He's founded vitalwarrior.org. He has another practice, and he's an outstanding case study of what you can do to improve your life. And it's like night and day, 2 different people.
Wow. Hey, did you know we have a world-class flight training school here in San Diego? Pilots can fly almost every day, which makes San Diego one of the best places to learn to fly in the whole world. Learn to fly with San Diego Flight Training International. Check out their deals just for gun owners. Radio listeners, check this out. 1 hour of ground school, 1 hour of flight, actually fly with an instructor, normally $400. Hey, for you guys, $350. Get started as easy as giving them a call at 858-569-1822. Learn to fly with STFTI, or call them at 858-569-1822.
So we are still talking with
Yeah,
Mike because he's a
absolutely.
talker and we like to talk to him. So Mike, I love psychology and I love what you're talking about with the brain, right? Like for me, it's always been very interesting. You know, I went to college and actually got a degree in psychology because I always wanted to know why people do the things that they do, right? Like it's the whole mentality behind that. So what you're talking about is all very interesting, but now I want you to kind of tie it together for us firearm individuals,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
how does the mental aspect affect firearms and like the way that you are as a shooter, as a CCW holder? Talk to us about how that kind of all ties together.
Cool. So let me go back and review that processing information is a cognitive function, right? So being able to process information and figure out what's going to happen next. When we do an assessment, we need to discern who else can help, who else needs to be shot, and who do we not want to get shot by. If there's security and law enforcement coming, there's a lot of decisions we're going to have to make.
A lot of things going on.
A lot of things going on. So we have to get really good at processing information. Now, if we don't learn how to process emotion, if we don't know the function of emotion, we don't know how to traverse that, then our logic and reason gets significantly diminished. There's a close friend of mine, Torrin Hill, I love his mantra is that stress is a performance diminishers. So let's see where you're really at when you panic. Let's see where you're really at. I don't care how good you looked with your rehearsal and how many takes you took with the recording. I don't care how you did in that force on force, because even force on force can be misleading if you don't design it right? It could still be a game. You still have some level of control. There's the element of surprise that you need, and there's some level of authenticity with professional role players that you need to have with how people actually respond to getting shot and how they actually behave when they're committing a crime.
So how do you teach this?
So the aspect of internal dialogue, there's a few different training methods to it, but ultimately on the emotional intelligence side, on the emotional functioning side, habituating the ability to shift from perception, where something's happening to me, where I'm getting fired from my job and life sucks and this is happening to me kind of thing, to perspective. Shift it out of that first person and take perspective and work the problem. What are the solutions I have? What is the big picture? What is the overarching goal? When we start doing more scenario type training, that's the same cognitive skill that we need to have. When I put people through a final simulation, I was just in Alabama, I had a female student who hasn't shot in a long time. She was having a lot of difficulty with her grip and trying to control her shots, and wasn't as precise as she could be. But once we triggered her intuition, basically her mama bear factor, right? I created a home defense scenario where she had to witness her kids getting shot. And the sun was setting, it was getting dark. And when the threat was imminent to her and the kid that she was protecting, she was able to extend the gun in parallel with the line of sight in a low light setting. We didn't even train for low light settings. And she was able to put the rounds on target where it needed to go. She performed much better in that circumstance when she integrated the feeling, the psycho-emotional part in that final evaluation.
You know, it's interesting that you talk about the mama bear, because when we had a shooting social a couple months ago, I had this individual who she was struggling so hard to hit the target, right? Like she was super scared. And so, you know, we kept taking her aside and just kind of talking with her, you know, it's a safe environment, and kind of talking her through that, right? So 15 minutes later, I came back and I was kind of checking on her, and she was doing super well with her targets. And you could see she was kind of getting over that fear. And so I asked her, I was like, what changed? And she said, Desi, I have to walk my 17-year-old daughter to the bus stop every day. And I just thought about what I would do if someone tried to hurt my daughter. And that triggered the mama bear instinct. And that's what I channeled here.
Work
Wow.
with
So
your
it was
instincts.
the mama bear.
That's
and
it.
so I think it's great that you talk about that because, I'm not a mom, right? But I've got anti-instincts is what I call that. And so if anything were to try to happen to those little ones that I would try to protect, right? Like we protect our own. And so those instincts, like even though we might not think about it, they are. It's just like you talk about Krav Maga, right? You go to block something, right?
Yes.
It's the same type of instincts that you're talking about.
100%. And that's what we really want to visualize in training. What they've done all kinds of research that when you visualize certain scenarios, those parts of the brain light up. They get activated when you're doing that in training. And so we definitely want to get good at technique. I don't want to dismiss technique. Based on the safety and complexity of the technique, we do need to isolate and get the fundamentals down. But when we talk about the intention and context of what we're doing, say, for example, dry fire, right? A lot of people spend a lot of time dry firing. And I like to use it as a diagnostic tool because most of trigger control is psychological. It's not really mechanical, right? And so we spend a lot of mechanical time on dry fire. That's cool. And then 2 or 3 shots of actual recoil tends to degrade it back to the default that they were prior to that. So when I train my students to recognize that they're anticipating recoil, I'll randomly load their magazine and not let them know that the next, exactly. They don't expect it to not go bang, and it'll be very evident. And now it enters their conscious awareness. Because when there's recoil, there's too much sensory information coming in, they don't recognize that they're doing that with the gun. But when you take away the bang, and they could visibly see that happening, okay, now we've diagnosed it. We do 1 or 2 dry fires. That's what you should do. Load another round in, boom, round is on target, right? And so a lot of the diminished performance is largely psycho-emotional, and we reintegrate the emotions back into it. People tend to perform better depending on where they're at with things and what the perception is with things. But the processing of information is probably the most unbalanced part in most of the training methods. We hyperfixate on technique and getting really fast. You know what I mean? I mean, the timers are really popular because that's what we know to be as the metric for performance. It's an objective metric is what people think, right? But the problem is when you do science, you're isolating things and removing other variables so you could judge this one thing. The problem is that only reflects the performance when all those things are isolated. Once you reintegrate everything else, then that measure is no longer valid. So if you take, for example, golf, everybody has to be perfectly quiet.
Golf is a perfectly good rifle range.
Exactly, right? Versus the game of basketball, where not only is it very disruptive, I mean, you get people doing that thing in the background, people throwing free throws, but now you're going to catch the ball at a random time, and you got someone trying to swat the ball when you're trying to take that shot, right? And so that's what you want to get good at, that disruptive environment. And so integrating the need to have a randomized cue to shoot. So if you have different colors to shoot, if someone other than yourself can say, shoot the blue, or shoot the number 2, or shoot the number 1. And then furthermore, you could even improve your survivability by maybe not staying on the X, right? And so if you move before you shoot, which is what you're likely to do, if it's an ambush situation, oh crap, I need to move to a position of advantage. You're not going to think about that. You're just going to do that, right? You're probably going to move somewhere else. And so the position in which you're shooting is not a choreographed one. You didn't prep yourself, right? But what we tend to see fundamentally is people kind of, let me get ready, let me get settled in my stance. And once I'm settled in my stance, then I'm going to go and be the superhero, right? Train ugly. It's okay to train ugly,
Yeah. You're not on TV. It's okay.
Yeah.
Get there.
So, Mike, I want to talk because I know we've got a couple minutes left until we got to let you go. So, for our listeners that are listening tonight, how can they train themselves better mentally in the aspect of like the firearms world? Like, what can they do to better train themselves?
Reduce choreography and increase unpredictability within reason. I mean, it all going to be dictated by safety and complexity, right? And so if they randomize the shooting commands, randomize the shooting position by simply moving left or right, one body width away, then the momentum may shift your weight to an non-predetermined position, right? Where maybe I have more weight on my right foot as I extend out and shoot. So getting used to that lateral movement and shooting from an unpredictable movement, they may drop some their marksman, their grouping, for example, right, might open up. But even grouping, how we think about grouping, I could go off on tangent. I'm going to try to keep it simple.
But before you go farther,
Yeah.
I do want, if people want to get more involved, let's say they want to get training from you or your group.
Sure.
How do they do that?
StrongholdDynamic.com. I have social media, Mike_DeSargo. I have my classes up there. They could look up USCCA website, look for training in San Diego, Odozura specifically. Okay. I hold my classes down at South Bay Rod and Gun Club, have another class.
Okay, so they come to you, you don't go to them.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just double checking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll go to people depending on.
But I mean, you'll do
circumstances.
groups. You'll do groups.
Yes.
You'll do individuals.
Yes. Private training, group training, and I also refer other instructors. Also, I'm giving a lot of the viable training methods.
It's all about education. It's all about education.
It's all about helping the people.
All right.
It's not just about. The compensation is nice, but I want to help the people.
You got to get back on radio, dude.
I look forward to coming back.
He's good. He's good. He could do his own show. I can tell you.
This is the one time it pays off.
Yeah. Well, it gives you an opportunity to tell your story to a lot of folks, and that's the key.
Thanks for watching this clip from Gun Owners Radio. If you're watching mainstream media, you're not getting the truth about guns. Gun Owners Radio is the easiest way to stay on top of the Second Amendment fight, the fight for your self-defense rights. You can watch our live stream on YouTube every Sunday from 4 to 6 p.m. California time, or if you're in San Diego, AM 1170, FM 96.1, The Answer. We're also available on your favorite podcast platform. Just search Gun Owners Radio and you'll find our show. Like and subscribe to help defend and restore the Second Amendment, not just in California, but across the country.